Hi everyone, I'm Gertie and welcome to a new month on Patreon. I'm so excited to be introducing the Gina Bustier. So if you read the first issue of our new magazine, and I hope you did, you'll know that I got really into season 2 of The White Lotus recently. And I was so inspired by all of the high-end Italian designs that they featured on that show. So I knew that I needed to do something inspired by that moment. So, thinking about Italian fashion and culture, one of my favorite actresses of the 50s and 60s, Gina Lollobrigida, also the most beautiful woman in the world. We had to name the Gina Bustier after her. So in this project, I'm really excited that we're going to be using some high-end construction techniques inspired by those Italian designers. So this bustier is really lingerie inspired. A lot of those Italian designers use a lot of techniques from 50s lingerie. So you're gonna see a sort of mashup of lingerie and high-end fashion techniques in this design. So you're gonna see that we added a lot of structure with the underlining, with fusible fleece to give the bra cup structure and support. We've done a complete clean finish throughout with channeling over the seams, which looks really beautiful and gives a beautiful finish. We use power net in the back panels, which gives you the flexibility and also a little bit of extra support. And then we've also done some pico elastic, which is a lingerie technique, right? You may remember from the Vargas panties around the neckline and the lower edge finish. So you have some options, as always, with this design. You can make it in 2 different lengths. We have a cropped length, perfect for summer, and it looks great with the Elsa culottes, by the way. And then you also have a full waist length, okay? So the other thing that we showed was making the Gina Bustier as a dress. So it doesn't interchange one-to-one with any of our other patterns, but it is possible to add a gathered skirt and a zipper in the back and make an adorable sundress. Today on camera, the version that you're gonna see being sewn is the waist length version of the bustier. And by the way, Kristen is going to be stepping in to sew this month, so thank you to Kristen. And next, we're gonna move on to pattern pieces and then fabric and supplies. So let's get started. Okay, so next we're going to talk about our pattern pieces, just like we do every month. I have minimized the pieces down to 50% so that you can see them all here together on the table and start to get a sense of how this pattern comes together. So the way the pieces are laid out now, it's from center front here to center back. And this is essentially how the bustier comes together. So you can start to get a sense of it. This is one half of it. All right, so let's go through the pieces one by one. This is the bra cup upper, the bra cup lower center, bra cup lower side. So these 3 pieces form the cup, okay? And these need to be cut in your fabric, your underlining, and your fusible fleece, which is going to give it that structure. Okay, and then let's go on to the midriff, which connects at the under bust seam here. You can see there are a lot of notches here. So there are 2 notches that connect to each lower cup piece, as well as a notch to match the center seam on those lower cup pieces. All right, and on all of these bodice pieces, you're going to see a horizontal line, which is the cut line for the cropped version. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, so now going around the side of the bodice, you have the side front, which has this interesting curved seam right here where the cup gets set in, and then the midriff here. And then your side back. Now, these 3 pieces we just reviewed, these need to be cut in your fabric and your underlining, okay? And next we're going to the bodice center back, and the zipper gets set in at center back. This piece is cut in power mesh, which is gonna give the bustier a sort of comfortable, stretchy feel. You're going to cut 2 in power mesh. Now, I did want to note that if you want more support from your bustier, if you want less stretch, you can cut 2 layers, meaning you would cut 4 power mesh, okay? So just keep that in mind. If you make a muslin and you just feel like you want a little more support, you want it to be less stretchy, you can always double up on the power mesh. Okay, and then finally we have your shoulder strap. Now this piece has to get cut in your fabric, interfacing, and underlining. All right, so keep that in mind. And also there are a few circles here that are really important. You want to make sure that you've marked the circle here on the bodice side front, which corresponds to the strap, so you know which way to attach it. And then we also have a circle at the bra upper cup. Okay, so make sure that you mark all of those, all right? So you've got a lot of little pieces to cut. All right, so those are your pattern pieces. And next we're going to talk about fabric and supplies. All right, so we are ready to talk fabric and supplies for the Gina Bustier. So first, let's talk about your outer fabric. We are recommending light to medium weight wovens for this pattern. So I'm going to give you a range of possibilities here. So on the top here, you'll see these are the samples that we used in the photo shoot. You may have heard me say in live streams recently that I'm very into linen right now, so we used a lot of linen. This is a printed handkerchief linen with this beautiful hydrangea print. It's a little bit sheer, but that's totally fine because it's going to be underlined, right? So you're going to get opacity from your underlining. So this is a nice lightweight linen. It looks beautiful in this design. If you do have a bigger scale print like this, just keep in mind you're going to have to be very mindful of how you cut it because these are a lot of little pieces, so you're not going to be able to get like a whole hydrangea bloom on one piece, right? So just keep that in mind and have a strategy for how you're going to do it. Now for Susie's adorable little set, we used a linen rayon blend, which is a nice, a little bit drapier fabric, still lightweight. And then you could also look at lightweight cottons. This is a Liberty Lawn, which would be a great choice too. Again, you're going to get more structure from your utility fabrics, which we're going to talk about next. This would be more like a medium weight cotton. This is a PK, which, you know, think about texture for this bustier. We used an embroidered cotton for Susie's dress, which looked really pretty, or a PK, something with a little bit of texture to give it some interest. Now, if you want to go on the heavier end, you could do denim. This would look so cool in something like this modeled denim. This is a little bit heavier, but it will give you that structure, right? Now, if you want to do a fancy bustier, I would recommend something like a silk dubioni. Would look so pretty in this. And I want to see someone make this bustier in a brocade. Okay, so I think that would look amazing. So you can go with some silks and do a sort of elevated version of this bustier. Okay, so those are your outer fabric possibilities. Again, there are a lot more in the instructions, so definitely make sure you review the list if you're not sure if something is appropriate. And next, we're going to be talking about the utility fabrics. You're going to need to underline several of these pieces. Now, if you've been watching my videos for a long time, you probably know that I really recommend muslin as a great all-purpose underlining. So that is one possibility. Medium weight muslin will give you a lot of structure. Now, keep in mind that you're going to be seeing the underlining on the inside of the garment. So if you want something that's a little prettier, maybe a little softer against the skin, any lightweight cotton will do. This is, I believe, a sateen or maybe a lawn, but it's just a really nice soft cotton, which would be great as an underlining. Now, underlining gives the bustier structure, but it also serves as a layer of opacity as well. So keep that in mind when you're choosing the fabric you're going to use for underlining. So for instance, in something like this handkerchief linen, you would want the underlining for opacity, and you would probably want a nice bright white cotton to really brighten up these white areas of the print. Okay, so that's your underlining. And then I want to talk about the fusible fleece next. This is for the bra cups. So fusible fleece is used often in bag making and sort of craft supplies. It's a kind of batting texture with glue dots on the back. So you can fuse it right to your fashion fabric, and it gives it this great structure and support in the cups. Now, I will say that it doesn't always bond well with some fabrics. We've tested it on some where it actually gives the outer fabric like a dimply kind of texture. So you definitely want to check this on a scrap of fabric. We've noticed it looks really great on linens, it looks great on cottons. If something's a little heavier, you probably won't notice any of that dimpling, but definitely check it out. And if you're seeing that dimpling, then the fusible fleece probably is not the best choice, and you may want to use something like a really thin, lightweight batting that you could find like in the quilting section, and then you would need to just zigzag those pieces together rather than fuse them to your cups, or underline them to your cups would be another option. Okay, so that is your fusible fleece. You are also going to need some, I keep calling it power mesh. I know that there's a little bit of a difference of opinion on what to call it. I know you guys have discussed it in the comments. I always call it power mesh because that's what the supplier we order from calls it. But I believe usually this heavier weight mesh is called power net, okay? So the source that we're going to give you for this, it's called power mesh, but you may find it in other places called power net. So just keep that in mind. What you're looking for is a stretch mesh with some structure to it, so a heavier weight. That's the important thing. No matter what they call it, where you order it, you want it to be heavier weight. You don't want a ton of stretch like that really lightweight mesh that we use for the Vargas panties. You don't want to use that here, okay? So keep that in mind. So this is for the center back piece on the bustier. And then our final utility fabric would be some fusible interfacing. We just used some lightweight cotton woven interfacing with fusible side. This is for the straps. And then you also need some interfacing to stabilize the center back zipper opening on the power mesh, okay? So you can also use, I love to use this, these rolls of fusible interfacing, which is already cut to the width that you need, which is 1.25 inches. All right, next we're gonna go to Pico Elastic. So this is to finish the edges, the upper edge and the waistline edge of the bustier. So you're gonna it's probably the same elastic that you use for your Vargas panties. So we have some overlap in supplies in these two projects. All right, so you're looking for some Pico Elastic. The edge is going to be showing on the edge of your bustier, so keep that in mind. Okay, so next let's move to the channeling. So there are 2 bones in this bustier at the side seams. So you're gonna need channeling for that, but we also followed a really high-end, ready-to-wear technique of finishing all of the seam allowances on the inside with channeling, okay? So you're going to need channeling for more than just the bones, so keep that in mind. And then you'll need a little bit of spiral steel boning. This is a pretty small garment and there are only 2 bones. So we found we were able to get both pieces we need out of one 18-inch length of boning, but you may need more depending on the size you're making and the length you're making, so keep that in mind. Now I also have some boning supplies here, including my beloved Greenlee 722 tool for cutting the bone, and then plumber's tape for finishing off the cut edges. So we already have one finished edge on both of these, and then I'll have to finish off the cut edge. Next, let's talk about your zipper. So there are 2 lengths that you may need depending on if you're making the cropped version or the full length version of a separating zipper. If you're making the cropped version, you'll need a 5-inch zipper. The length for the full length version is technically 7.25. I know that's not a zipper length you can get. So you can either cut a longer zipper down to that exact length, or you can get a 7-inch, just keeping in mind there'll be a little bit extra at the top and bottom, which really isn't a big deal in this design. Okay, so those are your 2 zipper lengths. You can either get metal like we used, and it is possible to adjust these. It's a little bit trickier. You can also go for a plastic or nylon coil separating zipper, which you can just cut at the length needed or fold off the excess at the top. So keep that in mind, but those are the 2 zipper lengths that you would be looking for. And then finally, you need your thread. Okay, so just all-purpose polyester thread like we always use for garment sewing. All right, so that is your fabric and supplies, and next we're gonna move on to sewing. Okay, you're gonna start with the two lower cup pieces, and they're already underlined, and then put them right sides together, matching the notches. And pin that seam. And now we're gonna take it to the machine and sew it at 5/8 of an inch. And make sure that you backstitch at each end. Okay, and the next things we're gonna do are press open the seam allowance and then trim the seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. So you can trim first if you like, or press first, it doesn't really matter as long as you do both of those things. And Kristen is using a ham here to help aid in pressing that curved seam open. And then trimming down those seam allowances to 1/4 inch in preparation for applying the channeling over it as a clean finish. Okay, so what you're gonna do next is to make a mark at 5/8 of an inch from the raw edge on this seam. And then we're going to cut a length of channeling to that length between your marks. So only the length of the seam without the seam allowances. So cut it exactly to that length. And now what we're going to do is we're going to place that boning channel over the seam allowance. And you really need to be very careful to center it exactly because we're stitching from the wrong side, but this stitching is going to be visible on the right side. So if you need to baste it first or whatever you need to do, or just eyeball it, you want to make sure that it's very centered. So we're going to edge stitch along one side and then turn the piece around and edge stitch along the other side of the channeling. So now you can see how nice and beautiful it looks on the inside, very enclosed, and then very neat on the outside as well. Okay, so now you're going to grab your bra cup upper and put it right sides together with that lower cup unit, matching the notch to the seam. And then you're going to pin along this edge here. Making sure that it matches at the 5/8 of an inch seam line on each end. And now you're going to stitch at 5/8 of an inch, back stitching at each end. Okay, next thing we're going to do is the same steps that you did for the lower cup seam, which is to press open that seam allowance using a ham to get that curve into the seam, and then trim down the seam allowances to 1/4 inch. And then finally, you're going to apply boning channeling over the seam line in the same way that you did for the lower cup. All right, you're going to take your midriff piece and put it right sides together with the completed cup and match the notch to the lower cup seam and pin along this edge right here, making sure that it matches at 5/8 of an inch on each end. And then we're going to stitch this at 5/8 of an inch, back stitching at both ends. And now the steps are exactly the same again. You're going to press that seam allowance open and spend a little more time on this seam just because it is really curved. And so you're going to press it from the inside, pressing it open, and then you may wish to check it from the outside and press from the right side as well if your fabric will tolerate it. And then finally, you're going to trim it down and repeat the channeling step that you did on the other seams. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we are going to take the side front, which is a kind of funny looking piece, and this is a vertical seam, a kind of angled vertical seam. So you're going to attach that front cup and midriff unit to the side front piece, pinning along the edge, and make sure you match any notches. And now we're going to sew it at 5/8 of an inch. And again, we're going to be repeating a lot of steps here because all of these seams are sewn pretty much the same way. You're sewing at 5/8 of an inch, back stitching at both ends. And then the next thing you're going to do is, just like we've done on all the other seams, is to press, trim down to 1/4 inch, and then apply your channeling from seam line to seam line. Okay, so you can see that we've attached the side front bodice and then also done the side back because it's the exact same thing yet again. So now the only panel that needs to be attached still is the center back, and that's the one that is cut in power mesh. So again, just pinning, matching notches and raw edges, and then stitching at 5/8 of an inch. And in this case, you may want to be just aware of putting the knit side or the power mesh side on the bottom, just to help it prevent any stretching of the power mesh. And stitch at 5/8 of an inch. And now on this seam, it's a little bit different. You are going to press the seam allowances away from the power mesh panel. And then yet again, trim down to 1/4 inch, and then center the boning channeling over that seam and edge stitch on both sides. Okay, so now you can see that both sides of the bustier are constructed with the channeling applied to every seam. And now you're going to put them right sides together at center front. And you should have a dot at the neckline. And that's a really important dot because you want to start your stitching there for the next seam. So make sure that that's marked and then continue pinning down the center front. And next we're going to stitch starting at the dot, back stitching and ending at the lower edge. Okay, and just like every other seam so far, you're going to press it open, trim down the seam allowances, and then apply the boning channeling, and just apply it from the circle down to the seam line at the lower edge. Okay, so we're now at the point in construction where if you are making a dress, you need to stop here because the next couple chapters are not going to apply to what you're doing. So what you need to do next is prepare your skirt. So for Susie's white dress, we just did a simple gathered skirt. So you'll want to construct that, and then you're going to sew it to your bustier at the waistline and insert your 18-inch zipper, okay? And then you're gonna need to skip forward a couple chapters in the video because the next thing you're gonna be doing is the boning chapter. And for those of you who are sewing the bustier, we're gonna move on next to inserting the zipper and then finishing the lower waistline edge with picot elastic. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is to apply the zipper. But first you're going to stabilize the center back seam allowances with fusible stay tape or strips of fusible interfacing that are 1.25 inches wide. So just, be mindful as you're pressing this. You want to, be careful not to melt your power mesh, but we found that it was fairly resilient with the iron. Okay, and then you're going to turn in the seam allowance. So 5/8 of an inch on both sides. What we're going to be doing is a centered zipper with the teeth exposed. So on both sides, pressing in 5/8 of an inch, and you can just kind of pin it in place in a few places just to get it to stay because power mesh doesn't really press crisply. Okay, and we're going to repeat the same thing on the opposite side. So just to repeat, 5/8 on each side. And now you're going to want to mark 5/8 of an inch from the top and the bottom so that you know where to center your zipper. Okay, so marking your seam allowance at the top and bottom. And now you're going to separate the zipper and place the side of the zipper underneath the folded in seam allowances so that the fold falls just next to the zipper teeth, but not on top of the zipper teeth. And then you're going to pin it in place, pinning through the power mesh and through to the zipper tape below. And next we're going to sew this on the machine using a zipper foot, stitching close to the fold of the power mesh. And make sure you backstitch at each end. Okay, and now we're going to sew the other side of the zipper. So again, marking those points at the top and the bottom, 5/8 of an inch from the edges. And it's a little easier to do this next part if you put the zipper halves back together again and zip it up. And here Kristen's just using the ruler behind there to create a barrier for her pinning. And again, just placing the fold next to the zipper teeth and pinning through the layers. Okay, and now we've stitched both sides. And one thing you can do just to get a nicer finish from the outside is to trim away the seam allowances of the power mesh behind the zipper tape. So Kristen is just cutting, she's clipping into the seam allowances at those 5/8 of an inch marks, and then trimming away the power mesh seam allowance between the marks, behind the zipper tape. And there you go, that is your applied centered zipper. All right, the next thing we're gonna do is to apply Picot elastic to the lower edge of the bustier to finish it. First thing you need to do is to turn up the waistline seam allowance 5/8 of an inch and press it in place all the way along the lower edge. And now you're going to grab your Picot elastic and you're going to cut a length of elastic that is 1/2 inch shorter than the waistline lower edge. It's going to stretch just slightly to fit. And now what we're going to do is trim down this seam allowance to exactly 1/4 inch. So you may want to mark this like Kristen is doing here, just marking a line at 1/4 inch and then trimming along your marked line. Okay, and you may want to just check your center back. Just close the zipper and make sure that everything is even. And just checking those seam allowances, that they're even at the bottom. And then you can trim away the seam allowance. Okay, now you're going to take your Picot elastic and make sure that edge is turned under and align one end at the center back opening and pin it in place. And then you may want to find the center of the elastic by folding it in half and then pinning that fold point to the center front of your bustier. And you can see that Kristen is pinning it so that the elastic is behind that folded in seam allowances and the Picot edge is going to show beyond the edge of the bustier. And then she's pinning the other side of the elastic at the opposite center back opening. So it's pinned at 3 points. And now she's aligning it so that the little picot edges just show beyond the folded edge. So just a few more points being pinned there. And now you're going to zigzag this on next to the fold. So you might want to use like a square-ish zigzag, so 2.5 by 2.5 would be good. Or if you have a 3-step zigzag on your machine, that would also be good. And there is your applied picot edge elastic. Okay, now we are going to cut some bones to put in the seam between the side front and the side back. So just 2 bones in this bustier. So you're gonna take a spiral steel bone and you're gonna wanna cut it 3/4 of an inch shorter than the seam line. So measuring from about the zigzag at the bottom up to the top, 3/4 of an inch shorter than the top. And cut the bone to that length. And you're going to need 2 of those, so just go ahead and cut 2 while you're at it. And in the studio, we use these bones that are 18 inches and they're finished already on each end because we can get a couple bones out of them and then only have to finish 1 cut edge on each of them. So next, we're going to finish those cut ends with some Teflon tape, also called plumber's tape. So just cut 2 little 2-inch lengths of this tape. And just put the bone up, halfway up the width of the tape and kind of twirl it around there and then fold in the ends and press them in to get a nice finished end. And then those bones are ready to insert into those side seam channels. So make sure you get them in the actual tube part of the channel rather than behind it. And then just scrunch it all the way down so that the bone is fully inserted into the channel on both sides. And there you go. The next thing we're going to do is to attach elastic to the underarm section. So the neckline and the underarm have to be done in 2 separate sections with the picot elastic. So this is pretty much a repeat of the waistline picot elastic step. The only difference is that this is a curved section. So what you're going to do is press it in 5/8 of an inch. And then you're going to want to clip into those curves just to help it lay flatter around the curves. Then trim down to 1/4 inch and place your elastic behind the seam allowance and zigzag it in place. And the only difference on this section here from the waistline is the picot elastic, instead of it cutting it 1/2 inch shorter, you're gonna cut it a full inch shorter than the length of the seam allowance. And that'll help it kind of cup the underarm area a little bit better, to have it cut a little bit shorter. Okay, so now what we're pointing out here is that the underarm elastic is ending 5/8 of an inch short of the seam allowance at the neckline. So you should have that 5/8 of an inch gap. And the next thing we're gonna do is to apply one piece of elastic to the neckline. So both sides of the neckline, one piece of elastic. So same deal again, you are going to turn in those seam allowances 5/8 of an inch and press them. No need to clip anything here because it's not curved. And you'll be able to press the center front easily because you left it open above the circle. And then trim that seam allowance down to 1/4 inch. And then again, the final thing is going to be cutting that length of picot elastic, and this time we're going back to 1/2 inch shorter than the seam line we're applying it to. And we're going to stitch on that picot elastic using a zigzag stitch behind the folded seam allowance. Okay, so grab your picot elastic again and measure it from point to point around the entire center front neckline, and cutting it 1/2 inch shorter than the actual seam line where you're applying it. And just the same thing again, so putting the elastic behind the folded in seam allowances with a little picot edge showing out the top and zigzagging in place. Okay, we're gonna sew the straps now. So what Kristen has already done is turned in the seam allowances, 5/8 of an inch on each long edge of the strap and trimmed it to 1/4 inch. And now we are placing boning channeling, which will not have boning in it, but just as a seam finish here, over the edge, and so that the edge of the channeling aligns just with the fold on the outer edge of the strap, and pinning it in place. And now what you're going to do is edge stitch along each side of the channeling. So just flip it around and do the other side. And now you're going to repeat that process on each side. Okay, so here's the finished straps, and so we've also finished the short edges using a serger. And you're going to have a circle mark on the front end of the strap to match the bustier, but it's also helpful to mark in the seam allowances on the short ends for placement. So just mark in 5/8 of an inch on each short end. And now grab your bustier and you're going to put the angled end behind that front neckline, matching the marks and also matching that marked in line that you just made with the finished upper neckline edge. And now use your zigzag stitch again to match the zigzag stitching that's already there and attach the strap using the zigzag stitch. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing with the back strap. So you'll probably want to try on your bustier just to check the length here and adjust if needed. But otherwise, you're just going to pin this in place like you did for the front, matching up that marked line to the side back bodice so it aligns with that seam line vertically. And then zigzag it in place. And that is the final step. Okay, everyone, so that is it. Your finished Gina Bustier. I hope that you love this project, and I also hope you've learned a lot of new techniques with this one. I cannot wait to see what you make. Don't forget to share your makes with me on social media. You can use the hashtag #CharmPatterns and Gina Bustier. Thanks so much for watching and for being patrons. I will see you next time. Goodbye.